Hello, Fiendlings. How the hell are you? My voice has been awful of late, and I haven't been able to record in what feels like weeks. The air is terrible right now, and the excessive heat warnings with no rain aren't exactly helping. Violet and I walk between the hours of 4 a.m. and 5:30, and even then she comes back panting and I'm covered in sweat. It's only June. Our hottest month is the beginning of September, ironically enough, and we're not even close to it. On better news, I'm getting ready to send Neptune's scars off to Sever Press next week, which is time enough for me to do one more large spot check, find any lingering issues, one final pass, and toss it over the wall. That will be a load off my mind, to be honest. I just hope I can finish recording the audiobook. So far, that ain't looking good. In case you didn't know, I have a vocal cord separation. The long and short of it is that my voice will only get weaker as time goes on, which is another reason I licensed the Black audiobooks to Fireside. I don't think I can re-record them. My hope at this point is that I'm able to get through Neptune's Scars and the final 2 books in that series. That's at least another 250,000 worth of words I need to narrate. I just don't know if it's going to happen. But enough of this wallowing in misery. There are great things afoot, like the morning standoff between my 8-pound cat and my 65-pound dog. Every day has cartoonish moments that keep me from losing my mind. I just hope my house survives the 2 of them chasing one another over furniture, into tables, slamming into bookcases, and destroying everything in general. I wouldn't trade them for the world. With that, I'm going to get out of here. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon.
Walking through the halls was eerier than he'd imagined. With his laptop bag dangling off one shoulder, Catfish really wished he had an entire pack of cigarettes stuffed in his mouth. This trip was right out of the video game Doom. The lights down the main hallway had been flickering since they entered the superstructure. The walls had large holes in them, the edges scorched as if burned. Polished metal gleamed from behind the damaged sheetrock. The hard floor reflected back their halogen lights as though it had just been waxed. As with Vrabel's team, they'd loaded a generator on a hand truck and connected the remaining halogen work lamps to it. 2 roughnecks who Catfish didn't know were at the front of the cart. Another was in the rear. Calhoun walked next to Catfish. Catfish and his boss carried high-power flashlights. Calhoun had said they would do the trick, but Catfish wasn't so sure. He wished the engineer hadn't insisted on keeping so many lights back on the deck. Then again, the sun would eventually go down and they needed to make sure they had something to fend off the creatures. Now that the fluorescents were on the verge of going out in the hallway, he wondered if they shouldn't be rethinking this plan. Big time. To get to the drilling office, they were going to have to pass the stairwell that led to the living quarters as well as the commissary. That big puddle of black could be anywhere in the rig, not to mention its smaller brethren. Vrabel had been taking his team to the eastern stairs to gain easier access to the bridge. He hoped they were having better luck with the lights. If anything happened to Shauna, he'd personally blow the rig up as a final fuck you to whatever was on it. They crept slowly toward the stairwell. The 2 men in front had their halogens pointed straight down the hall. As they neared it, one of them said, "Stop," in a low voice. Catfish and Calhoun stopped the hand truck and waited. The roughneck walked sideways across the entrance and bathed the landing in light. "Shit," he whispered. "What is it?" Calhoun asked. The man didn't turn around. "Stairwell metal is shining damn bright. The sheetrock is gone. Completely. Only things left are burned wood and metal." "That tracks," Calhoun said. "It could be in the walls now, guys, as well as the vents." He turned on his flashlight and shined it up at the ceiling tiles down the hall. Vents were spaced out every few meters or so. "We need to be damned careful." "No shit," the roughneck behind them said. "What's his name? Jim? Damn it," Catfish thought. Calhoun didn't respond or turn to the man. "Ready when you are, Terry." The roughneck staring into the stairwell flinched a little at his name and then stepped past the entrance. They kept moving. Catfish peered into the stairwell as they passed. As Terry said, the landing was a goddamn mess, and yet clean as a whistle. The usual detritus of rig grime from boots was completely absent. The sheetrock was gone, all right, and the wooden studs looked as though they'd met a flamethrower. Well, now they knew the thing could consume wood, too. Catfish kept one hand on the dolly to help push while holding the halogen flashlight in the other. He and Calhoun flashed their lights up at the vents as they had before, but something felt off. The deeper they walked into the superstructure, the more fetid the air. The drilling office entrance was close. Catfish went over in his mind what he needed to do. It was simple, really. He needed to hook up the laptop, download a few files, and reconfigure the rig cameras to talk to his laptop. Once that was done, they'd be able to see what was going on as they executed Calhoun's plan. When they reached the door to the drilling office, Terry blew a sigh out between his teeth. "Now what?" he asked. The door was open. Not because someone had left it open, but because it had been dissolved into nothing. A gleaming brass doorknob and locking mechanism sat at the threshold. Calhoun scanned the debris. He cursed and then waved his flashlight toward the drilling office entrance. "We go in," he said. He turned to Catfish. "You take the left side, I'll take the right." Catfish nodded. The sight of the damaged walls, the flickering lights, and the damned doorknob on the floor had sent his pulse racing. "If I see it, I'll make sure I heard it." "Good," Calhoun said. "Terry, Aaron, we need you to go in first and give the all clear, then we'll push the generator past the threshold. Once we're inside, we'll need y'all to cover us while Catfish punches some keys. Got it?" "Yeah," the two men grumbled. Calhoun glanced over his shoulder. "Joel, guard the door. Keep the light pointed out into the hall." The large bearded man nodded. Catfish wasn't sure if Joel was mute or just didn't like to talk, or maybe he was as terrified as the rest of them and didn't want anyone to hear it in his voice. Didn't matter. Catfish could tell the man would do his job. He'd volunteered to take the rear guard, and in some ways, Catfish thought that was more dangerous than being up front. Terry walked through the entryway first, Aaron close behind. Their cords stretched as they traveled a few feet inside. He could hear whispered cursing, but little else. "Clear," a voice called. Catfish ground his teeth as he and Calhoun pushed the generator into the office. There was barely enough room for the hand truck, and it took some work to get it inside. If the door had still been attached, it would have been impossible. As it was, they dug huge gouges in the remains of the wooden frame. The drilling office was quiet, except for the hum of the computers. Catfish glanced over at Harriban's workstation. He wished the man was still there, talking to himself and picking green gold from his nostrils. He sighed and took another long look around the room. He swept all the nooks and crannies with the high-powered light. No sign of the black. He let out a sigh, released the hand truck, and headed to his workstation. Terry walked beside him and kept the light shining on the area in front of the computers. If the things wanted somewhere to hide, the actual server room was the perfect place, although under a desk or printer stand would do just as well. Calhoun had read his mind. The engineer squatted a meter away from the line of workstations, his light stabbing into the darkness beneath the computer desks. That was good. At least someone had some common sense. Catfish hit the keyboard and then logged in. He brought up a console and connected to the control server. Vrabel had given him the username and password he'd need to reconfigure the camera feeds. He added his laptop's MAC address to the push list and then reloaded the camera service configuration. A green OK appeared on the console. He dug his laptop out of the bag, opened the lid, and then hit the camera service IP address. His browser immediately filled with 6 real-time images. He felt someone staring and turned to Calhoun. The engineer's eyebrows were raised. Catfish nodded to him. The keys clacked beneath his nimble fingers as he traversed to the directory he needed. He transferred the latest AUV configuration files to his laptop and checked to make sure they were there and in good shape. The last thing he needed was for them to have made this trip for nothing. "Okay," Catfish said. "I think I have what I need." Calhoun nodded. "Let's get the fuck out of here," he said. Both his eyes and his light were fixed on a spot above the workstation. Catfish slowly turned his head and saw what his boss had seen. High on the wall, an AC vent was darker than it should have been. Its once white-painted face now shined beneath Calhoun's light. There was something in the vent, something the light couldn't quite reach. He slipped the laptop back in its case, stood, and threw the bag over his shoulder. Once the heavy flashlight was back in his hands, he felt a little better, but whatever was in that vent had chilled his blood. He walked over and stood next to Calhoun. "It's in there," he said. Calhoun nodded. "The question is," he said, "is which one?" "We ready to get out of here?" Joel asked from the doorway. The man's light was still facing the doorway, but he turned around to stare at them. "Joel!" Calhoun yelled, but it was too late. While he was turned to them, a black tendril of ooze grew from the top of the doorframe. As Joel's head turned back to the hallway, the tendril reached forward and wrapped around his neck. Joel dropped the halogen light and it shattered when it hit the floor. He wrapped his hands around his neck to try and pull the thing off. Severed fingers dropped to the floor like sliced sausages. The tendril ripped him off his feet. The sizzle and stench of burned flesh filled the drilling office. Joel's screams were cut off as his body disappeared into the hallway. Both Terry and Aaron stood frozen just a few meters away from the doorway. Catfish breathed in shallow gasps. "Jesus." Calhoun looked back up at the vent. "It's still there. Aaron? Terry?" The two men kept staring at the empty doorway. "Guys!" Calhoun yelled. The two roughnecks turned to him. "Keep your fucking lights aimed on that doorway. One high, one low." Catfish pointed his light at the vent. The black thing was still in there. "Jesus, you think those two are working together?" "I don't know," Calhoun said. "Not sure I want that to be true." "Me neither," Catfish gulped. "Back into the hall?" "Yes, back into the hall." Calhoun walked toward the hand truck. The air had turned hazy from the generator's exhaust. It was getting hard to breathe. "We need to keep moving," Calhoun said. He pointed to Aaron. "You, cover our backs. Terry, you take point. Catfish?" "Yeah, I'll cover the vents." "Good." Terry got in front of the hand truck and Aaron took his position behind Calhoun. "Let's go," the engineer said. Catfish lingered for a second to make sure the thing in the vent stayed there. As he turned and got behind Terry, he wished like hell they could close a hatch behind them. Steel buckled with a shriek. The entire left side of the hallway bowed outward as wooden studs disintegrated. A pair of black tentacles struck through large gouges and wrapped around Dick, the man's shoulders smoking and sizzling at the black's touch. Dick's lamp crashed to the floor and the light went out. Creeley shouted and pointed the high-powered light at Dick's shaking and twitching body. Smoke curled up from the black tentacles, but they refused to let go of their prize. They dragged Dick's screaming body through the wall with a crunch. Blood splattered against the walls and Shauna's face as Dick's head popped off his shoulders and rolled to the ground. "Green!" Creeley yelled. From behind the shattered wall they heard the sounds of frying bacon. "Green!" Bob yelled again as he held his head in his hands and wailed. Shauna could barely hear anything over the sound of her heart. She turned and stared back at the bridge hatch. Bill helped Gomez limp toward the generator while Vrabel stared down the hallway. She turned back and realized she was far too close to the buckled wall. She stepped backward until her ass hit the hand truck. "I need a light," she yelled. No more than a second later, Vrabel was beside her, his light pointed at the wall. "Wipe your face," he said. Shauna brought a hand up and wiped the wetness away from her left cheek. As difficult as it was, she did her best not to look at her palm. She rubbed it against her moist and soiled khakis. "How are we going to get past that?" She pointed at the wall. Vrabel grunted. "We shine our lights. We go forward." "Chief," Gomez said from behind them. "Glad you're still alive," Vrabel said without turning around. "I have something for you," Gomez said. Shauna turned as he produced a large red gun from his trouser pocket. She saw his ruined hand. The pinky had been bisected along with parts of his palm, the skin scorched and blistering where the black had touched him. Gomez handed the weapon to Bill and he held it out to Shauna. "Flare gun?" she asked as she took it. Gomez nodded. His undamaged hand slipped into his pocket and he lifted out several rounds. Bill took them and passed them to Shauna. "Be careful," Gomez said. "That thing's loaded." "Good to know," she said. Vrabel's light was still pointing at the wall. Diesel exhaust choked the hallway. "We have to move," she said, "or we're all going to pass out." "Right. Bill?" Vrabel asked. "Ready, boss." Vrabel looked at Creeley. "Cover our ass." Creeley still looked as though he was in shock, but he nodded. With that, Vrabel took the lead. Shauna got behind the hand truck and began pushing. Her arms felt like overcooked noodles, but they had to make it out of the rig and back to the deck. Once they were down the stairs, they'd be in natural light again, although that didn't seem to deter the thing too much. As they passed the blood-drenched wall, she forced herself not to look. The hallway ahead was dark. The creature had destroyed enough of the electronics in the ceiling to short them out. Vrabel's halogen beams spread out before them in a rectangle of white light, but the hallway's length seemed to eat the light before it hit the back wall. Shauna wanted to run. She wanted to push the cart as fast as she could while Vrabel sprinted ahead. Vrabel held up a hand and cocked his head to one side. She stopped pushing, took a deep breath, and listened. The wind outside buffeted against the raised superstructure, but that's not what had stopped Vrabel in his tracks. Somewhere up ahead, or maybe around one of the corridors, something made a tapping noise. "Is someone trapped?" she asked. Vrabel shrugged. The tapping sound increased to a metallic rattle. He lowered his hand and continued down the wall. Shauna followed with the hand truck, Gomez's heavy breathing chuffing behind her. There was a shudder in his exhales as she wondered if one of his lungs was filling with blood. The sounds in the other corridor stopped. Vrabel paused in his steps and cocked his head to listen. Shauna heard nothing. Whatever those sounds had been, they were gone now. The rig chief started moving again, and the battered entourage followed. Creeley's light constantly shifted from the left to the right as he illuminated the upper vents. Shauna kept listening for that sizzling sound or the rending of metal. If the creature learned that it could dissolve the wooden studs that supported the metal framing, they could be in big trouble. The first level of the rig's superstructure could collapse at any time. After an eternity of slow steps, Vrabel reached the corner and held up a hand. Shauna stopped. Her eyes watered from the generator's exhaust. Vrabel leaped into the adjoining hallway, light held out before him. "Oh, fuck," he said. "What is it?" she asked. "Guys, we have to find another way." Bill cursed. "Gotta be kidding me, boss. What the hell's the problem?" Shauna walked around the hand truck and peered around the corner. The ceiling was a disaster. The lights were off, but she could see twisted metal dangling from where ceiling tiles and light fixtures once hung. The floor was clean but warped. "Shit," she said. "I think it ate the supports beneath the floor." Vrabel nodded. "Yeah, I'm guessing the floor's not going to support our weight. Not to mention it has plenty of places to drop down on us now." He shook his head. "How smart are these fucking things?" Shauna clucked her tongue. "Smart enough," she said. "It's got us trapped." "Creeley?" Vrabel shouted. "Yeah, boss." "Check the other corridor," the rig chief said. Shauna watched the large, bald man walk forward and then turn in the other direction. His halogen lit up the other end of the adjoining hallway. "Damn it," she said. "We're totally fucked, boss," Bob said. The other hallway was a shambles. In addition to the ceiling being a complete mess and the warped floor, the black had eaten large enough holes in the walls for the ductwork to come loose and point at the floor. The ooze could pour out of the vents like a faucet. Vrabel panted. "I think we need to." The walls started to make that sizzling sound. "Get back to the bridge." Shauna didn't wait. She bolted to the hand truck and started to pull it down the long hallway. Gomez and Bill had already started to move in that direction, but Bob's extension cord was taut. She turned her head. "Let's go!" Vrabel appeared from around the corner, his light aimed behind him. "Bob, cover the rear," he said, and ran toward Shauna with his light held high. She was blinded by the sudden stabbing brightness. "I've got you, Shauna," Vrabel said as he reached the other side of the hand truck. Creeley's cord was still taut. "Creeley, move it!" Bob stepped backwards from the hallway, his light kissing the walls and the ceiling. Something above them groaned. "Bob, run!" Shauna yelled. But it was too late. Creeley raised his head to look up, and then a pool of black poured from the ceiling and swallowed him. The sound of frying flesh filled the hallway. His light popped and exploded as the ooze shorted out the electronics. The generator growled loudly, and then Vrabel's light started to flicker. "Fuck the lights!" he shouted. "Run!" Vrabel pushed her away from the hand truck and leaped over it. She pelted down the hallway toward the wan light coming through the open bridge hatch, Vrabel's heavy footsteps behind her. Bill and Gomez disappeared into the bridge just as she cleared the threshold. She turned, the flare gun in her hands. Vrabel's halogen pointed down the hallway. He finally ran out of slack and the light jerked from his hands and hit the floor with a thud. Vrabel stopped running and turned to grab the lamp. The white light bounced off the metal beams and created a dim pool of light around the generator. As Vrabel's hands scrabbled for the light, the barely illuminated portion of the hallway turned black. "Forget the light! Run!" she screamed. Vrabel raised his eyes, saw what she saw, and started to sprint. His right boot tangled in the cord from Bill's dropped lamp, and he fell face first with a thud. Shauna ran forward and put her left hand around his outstretched arm. She pulled as hard as she could. His limp body started to move forward, but the black was closing in. She fell backward on her ass, took aim, and pulled the trigger. The hallway exploded into red and orange light as the flare raced past the generator and slammed into the floor. Flames shot out of the pool of black. It trembled and shook like pudding as the fire spread. The entire hallway was ablaze. Shauna used both hands to pull Vrabel forward. The man moaned in pain. The flames were going to reach the generator. It was going to explode, and they were both going to die. "Run, damn it!" Bill yelled from behind her. He bent and took Vrabel's hands, his strong biceps bulging as he pulled the man toward the bridge. Shauna didn't have to be told twice. She ran as fast as she could through the hatch, and seconds later, Bill carried Vrabel into the room. Shauna shut the hatch and swiveled the wheel. Through the walls they heard the sound of a roaring fire. Tendrils of smoke curled through the AC vents. She didn't know if she'd killed the black, but they might die in this room anyway. The sprinkler systems weren't working, and there was no telling how far the fire would spread.